The evening air was thick with tension as Officer Ryan Carter tightened his grip on his baton. The dimly lit street was quiet, the usual city noise muffled by the weight of an unfolding confrontation. He had been patrolling the neighborhood for years, and to him, anyone standing alone on this block at night was a suspect. His eyes locked onto a tall black man in a crisp suit standing near a parked car. Something about the man's presence irked him. Maybe it was the confidence in his stance, the calm in his expression. Something Carter wasn't used to seeing in people he usually confronted. "Hey, you," Carter barked, stepping forward. "What are you doing here?" The man turned his head slowly, his deep brown eyes meeting Carter's with an unsettling steadiness. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice smooth but firm. Carter clenched his jaw. He hated when people questioned him. "I asked what you're doing here," he repeated, louder this time. "This isn't your neighborhood. You waiting for someone?" The man sighed, looking almost amused. "I don't believe I need to explain my presence on a public street, officer." That was it. That tone, that attitude. Carter had dealt with enough troublemakers in his career to know when someone was trying to challenge his authority. His frustration bubbled to the surface as he took a step closer, his hand hovering over his holster. "I don't like your attitude," he sneered. "You people always think you can get away with anything. Show me some ID, right now." The man tilted his head slightly, considering Carter with an expression that was unreadable. Then, with a small, deliberate movement, he reached into his pocket. Carter tensed, ready to react, but the man simply pulled out a wallet and flipped it open. A badge gleamed under the streetlight. For a second, Carter couldn't process what he was looking at. The words on the badge didn't register immediately, but when they did, his stomach dropped. Inspector Jonathan Miles, his precinct, his jurisdiction, his superior. The street seemed to close in around Carter as reality hit him like a freight train. He had just insulted, no, humiliated, a high-ranking officer without even realizing it. And from the look on Miles' face, the night was far from over. The moment the badge gleamed under the streetlight, Officer Carter's heart skipped a beat. The words, Inspector Jonathan Miles, seemed to burn into his eyes, searing away any trace of the cocky confidence he had moments before. His mouth went dry. Miles didn't seem bothered at all. In fact, he remained as calm as he had been from the start, his gaze steady and unwavering. Carter's mind raced. He had messed up badly. This was no ordinary man. This was someone who had the power to end his career with a single word. "You," Carter stuttered, his hand still hovering awkwardly by his holster. "Relax, officer." "Carter," Miles said, his voice smooth like glass but with a sharp edge to it. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Carter forced himself to breathe. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, but he was a professional. He couldn't let this man see how rattled he was. But inside, his stomach churned. This wasn't how he envisioned his night going. He cleared his throat. What are you doing out here?" Miles tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "I could ask you the same thing. What's your reason for bothering me?" Carter hesitated. He wanted to take control of the situation again, but the weight of Miles' presence made it feel impossible. Miles wasn't just an officer. He was someone with the power to expose Carter's deepest insecurities, and Carter knew that the kind of power Miles held wasn't something anyone could simply ignore. "I didn't mean any disrespect," Carter muttered, his tone shifting as he quickly regained some composure. "I didn't know who you were." Miles remained silent for a moment, almost as if he was studying Carter's every word. The streetlights flickered above, casting eerie shadows on the ground between them. Carter couldn't help but feel like the tension between them was growing, thicker by the second. "You're not the only one who patrols these streets, Carter," Miles said quietly. "But you're the one with the badge, so you should know how to behave." Carter nodded slowly, his pride taking a hit. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. He'd crossed a line. I'll let you go," Carter said, stepping back, but Miles raised a hand to stop him. "Not so fast." Miles' voice cut through the air, and Carter froze. "You think just because I'm in your precinct, you can get away with insulting me?" Carter's heart pounded in his chest. I didn't know you were. Miles' eyes narrowed sharply. I know what you meant. A moment of silence passed between them, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Carter didn't dare move or speak, afraid of digging himself deeper. You should be careful, Carter, Miles added, his voice dropping to a low, almost dangerous whisper. This doesn't end here. Carter's face flushed, and he instinctively took a step back. But Miles didn't make a move toward him. Instead, he simply stood there, his posture unwavering. There was something eerie about the way Miles held himself, something that made Carter feel like he was being watched, and in a way, he was. For the next few seconds, neither man spoke. The silence between them seemed to stretch on forever, the only sound being the distant hum of the city. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play here, something bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Just when Carter thought he couldn't take the silence any longer, Miles finally spoke again, his voice cool and even. You've got a lot to learn, Carter. Carter swallowed hard, his mind racing. What does that mean? Miles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply gave Carter a cold, calculating look, like he was trying to decide if the younger officer was worth the trouble. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and began walking down the street, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Carter stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should he follow? Should he confront him again? Miles had already made it clear he wasn't going to tolerate any more mistakes from him, but there was a part of Carter that couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something much more complicated. And what bothered him the most? Miles had said nothing about his rank or position, not directly at least. He could have easily introduced himself as an inspector right away, but instead, he let Carter squirm for far longer than necessary. It was a power move, Carter realized, one designed to show him just how insignificant he was in the grand scheme of things. For a moment, Carter stood there in a daze, his mind still reeling from the encounter. But then he shook his head, trying to push aside the anxiety bubbling in his chest. Whatever this was, whatever game Miles was playing, Carter wasn't going to let it consume him. He had a job to do. But as Carter turned to walk back to his patrol car, a nagging thought kept tugging at the back of his mind. What did he mean by, "This doesn't end here"? The next few days were a blur of routine patrols and paperwork for Carter. But even in the monotony, Miles' words echoed in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that the inspector was more than just a powerful figure. There was something about him, something Carter couldn't quite place, that made the entire encounter feel off. It wasn't just the insult. It wasn't even the rank or the authority. It was the way Miles had looked at him, like he already knew something Carter didn't, like he was setting him up for something far bigger than an evening of bad judgment. A few days after their encounter, Carter found himself called into the precinct office. His stomach dropped as he walked into the familiar space, and he noticed a few faces glancing up at him before quickly looking away. As he stood there in the doorway, he saw Miles seated at his desk, staring at some paperwork with an unreadable expression. Carter hesitated for a second, wondering if this was the moment he'd been dreading. Miles looked up, his gaze piercing. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Come in." Carter walked in, his steps heavy. He didn't know what this meeting would hold, but one thing was for sure. It wasn't going to be easy. Carter stepped into the office, his boots clicking against the polished floor as the door clicked shut behind him. The air inside was thick, charged with something he couldn't quite place. Miles sat behind the desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. The dim fluorescent light overhead hummed faintly, casting sharp shadows on the walls. For a moment, Carter wondered if Miles had been waiting for him, or if he had been sitting there all along, watching the clock tick and waiting for Carter to walk in. "Take a seat," Miles said, his voice even, but there was an undercurrent of something Carter couldn't quite pin down. It was as though Miles was daring him to take a seat, to engage in whatever game was unfolding. Carter pulled out a chair, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He sat, trying to appear calm, but the nervous energy coursing through him was impossible to hide. His palms were slick against the edge of the chair. He wiped them on his pants before folding his arms in front of him, trying to protect himself. Miles didn't say anything at first, simply watching him. It was as if he were studying Carter, trying to figure him out, to see how far he could push him without breaking him. Carter felt his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. Finally, Miles leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You've been under my radar, Carter," he said, the words slicing through the silence like a knife. "For a while now." Carter's stomach dropped. What did that mean? Had Miles been watching him all along? The thought sent a chill through his spine. He had no idea what kind of trouble he was in, but he knew it wasn't good. "Do you know what that means?" Miles continued, his voice lowering, making Carter feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall. Carter swallowed hard, but his voice came out steady, despite the storm raging inside him. "No, sir. I don't." Miles nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It means I've seen how you work, how you handle situations. You've got potential, Carter, but you don't know how to use it yet." Carter blinked, trying to make sense of what Miles was saying. Potential? He hadn't expected that. He had expected anger, frustration, maybe even some kind of punishment. But potential? What was Miles talking about? Miles leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Carter's face. "The way you approach things. You're rough around the edges, but I can see something there. Something you haven't tapped into." Carter wanted to respond, to ask why Miles was being so cryptic, but he held back, unsure of where this conversation was going. Every word out of Miles' mouth seemed like another puzzle piece he couldn't quite fit together. "I don't understand," Carter said, his voice quiet. "What do you mean?" Miles let out a sigh, almost as if he was disappointed in Carter's lack of understanding. "You think this job is all about following orders, don't you? That you just show up, do your time, and everything will fall into place. But that's not how it works, Carter. You've got to make your own path. You've got to be willing to step outside the lines. And right now, you're playing it safe. Too safe." Carter's mind raced. This wasn't the conversation he had expected. He'd thought Miles was about to rip into him for the encounter the other night, but instead, he was talking about something else entirely, something deeper. But even as Miles spoke, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here. There had to be. This wasn't just about his potential. It was about control, power, something far bigger than a simple career discussion. "I don't understand what you're asking me to do," Carter said, his voice a little more strained now. "I'm just trying to do my job. I'm not here to cause problems." Miles chuckled, a low, almost mocking sound. "No one here is causing problems, Carter. You're the problem. You're too focused on the rules, too worried about stepping on toes. And that's not how things get done around here. Not in my precinct." Carter clenched his fists, the anger rising in his chest. "I'm just trying to do things right. I don't need to step outside the lines to do my job." But Miles didn't seem to be listening. He was already moving on to something else, as if Carter's response was meaningless. "You're naive, Carter," he said, his voice suddenly colder. "I thought you might have the grit, the fire. But maybe you're just another one of those officers who thinks he can get by with doing what's expected of him. You're not going to last here long if that's your attitude." The words hit Carter harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on doing his job well, following the rules, keeping his head down. But now it seemed like that wasn't enough. Now it felt like the very thing that had kept him safe and secure in the precinct was the thing that might destroy him. "I can handle myself," Carter said, his voice quieter, but firm. "I don't need anyone telling me how to do my job." Miles stood up suddenly, his movements sharp and calculated. He walked toward the window, looking out over the city below, as if considering something. "I wasn't asking you to follow my orders, Carter," he said, his tone a little softer, but still heavy with meaning. "But you're going to have to learn to think for yourself. Think beyond the badge, beyond the rules. And when you do, you might just realize that this world, this city, isn't as black and white as you think it is." Carter watched him, trying to make sense of his words. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the sense of unease growing by the second. There was something about Miles that unsettled him, something that made him question everything he knew about his job, about himself. But before Carter could respond, the door to the office opened, and one of the other officers stepped in. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Sir," the officer said, his voice shaking. "There's been an incident. A big one. You need to see this." Miles turned to look at the officer, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Carter saw something flash across his face, something darker, something dangerous. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by his usual calm demeanor.